Welcome to a follow-up video on the topic of hearing chord changes. In the first video, we focused on playing the percentages, meaning that what is the most likely change that you're hearing. Such as when you start off on a song, 95% of the time that first chord you're playing is the key that you're in. There's even a more sure way to know what key you're in, and that is to go to the very final chord, and 99% of the time the last chord that you play is the key that you're in. Quickly recapping two of the other percentages that we covered in the first video. Usually that first chord change in a bluegrass or a country song that you're hearing is about 70% of the time going to the 4 chord. And the other one that you can really hang your hat on is that the last change you hear before it comes back to 1 and wraps things up is you are 95% of the time hearing a 5 going back to 1. In this video, we'll stretch out and try to recognize the sound of certain types of chords, specifically major, minor, and 7th chords, and where you can expect that each type is being used. In the first video, we were talking about chords as if we were playing in a jam session. Here I'd like to also show you an idea how to figure out what key of recording is, so you then could figure out your chords. Knowing that the song 95% of the time begins on the 1 chord, I'm going to try to match the bass note that matches that first downbeat that I'm hearing. So I'll just move along my bass string. It'll work for a mandolin and banjo as well. Whatever your lowest string is, keep going until you find the note that matches in. So I eventually settled in on this note right here, which happens to be a B flat on guitar. At that point, as a guitar player, you're probably thinking, well, I'll capo 3 and play out of G. Then your 1, 4, 5 chords are still G, C, and D. If you're a mandolin player and you discover that that bass note is a B flat, then you're thinking B flat, E flat, F as your 1, 4, 5 chords. One thing that will help you hear that low note better is if you have the ability to crank up the bass on your speakers. It's the bass player, when the downbeat comes around, that you're guaranteed is playing that root note, in this case B flat, whereas the lead instrument may be on another note of the chord. A mistake people make when they're trying to figure out whether they're hearing a major, minor, or 7th chord, I think, is that they're trying to hear a major, minor, or a 7th chord. When you're first learning this, I think it's better to compare the textures that you're hearing. So here's our major chord, and I'm going to give that the color red. So when I hear a minor chord compared to that major chord, to my ear, I would describe that as being a little bit softer, so let's go with pink on the minor chord. Going back to the red of the major chord, I would call this 7th chord something a little more bold, a little more shocking than the red. So we'll give that 7th chord an orange flavor. So let's also give a descriptor to each of those flavor of chords. We'll do it now with the D chord. If that's our major chord, well, we'll call that our normal sound, because in truth, in the style of music we're playing, 80% of your chords are major chords at least. So if we move that to the pink, can also call that a mellower sound than the bright normal sound. And then when we go to the 7th, see if you don't agree, that's a little more tense. They even have this term that tension requires release, so that 7th chord is going to lead you somewhere. In the case of a D7, it leads you back home to G. So let's have you guess whether you're hearing a red, pink, or orange chord. I'm going to be playing chords all over the neck. They're going to be one of the three types, either normal, mellow, or tense, major, minor, or seventh. We'll put on the lick protector for those of you that know guitar chords. You're only going to hear the chords. You won't see my hand here. So here's our first chord. Decide if it's red, pink, or orange. And that is a pink chord, so it's the mellow minor chord. See what you think about this chord. That actually has that bright sound. It's a red major chord. And let's see what you think about this chord. So we went back to our mellow sound there. So we have a minor chord. And what about this chord? Should be able to hear that last note really brought it into the tense, orange, seventh chord. We previously mentioned about the seventh chords leading you to the next chord. So when a major chord goes to a seventh, there's a certain expectation about what the next chord will be. So if we're in the key of D, and we hear D, D7, we should be expecting to hear the 4 chord. So 1, 1, 7, 4. Blue ain't the word for the way that I feel. Here's the same concept in the key of G. So if we hear a G, that's our 1, and we turn that into a G7, 1, 7, we should be expecting to hear a 4 chord C after that. I was waltzing with my darling to the Tennessee waltz. Another very common place to hear a 7th chord is when the 5 chord returns to 1. So we're in the key of G, our D7 brings us back to G. Notice that when we were in the key of D, we introduced a D7 to take us to G. So that tension always gets released coming back. So at the end of a progression, in the sky, Lord, in the sky, that resolution, the 5 coming back to 1, it can be just a straight D or it can be a D7. Another place where you've heard 7th chords is when you're hearing sounds that seem to be sort of bluesy. That's the favorite Creedence Clearwater chord. They used it in several songs. It's an E7. It's got that little edge to it. And when you're hearing straight out blues songs, might use 7th chords throughout the progression. They're not using them as leading chords at that point. They're just adding some tension to the overall sound, which you recognize in the blues. Moving on to minor chords, you have songs already burned into your ear that begin on a minor chord. So you take that texture, that sound, and then say, well, this other chord I'm hearing must be a minor chord. Here's an example of a song I'm sure you've heard. You can name that tune hearing that. House of the Rising Sun. It begins on an A minor chord. Another famous rock song. That first chord falls into the mellow category. There's another A minor, but up on this position of the neck. One last one would be like this. Even though Well, there's some fancy strumming going on. Mellow sound. Sultans of Swing by Dire Straits begins on a D minor chord. If we're thinking key of G in a bluegrass song and we hear a minor chord, well, playing the percentages, probably better than 50% of the time, that minor chord is going to be E minor. It has a term called relative minor. It's relative to the G because it sounds pretty darn close. But again, you can hear that mellow sound, so we have a minor chord. All of these songs have that E minor in it if they were played in the key of G. Another place where we hear the E minor chord in bluegrass tunes is as a chord substitution. That means that the song normally would have a G chord there, but some people will put in the E minor. So many people play Amazing Grace like this toward the end. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. Was blind could just be G. Was blind, but now I see. So the guideline when using a substitution is that the melody note is still supported. This B note, blind, blind, is both in the E minor or the G. Here's a common substitution that you hear in the song Circle Be Unbroken. Gets toward the end of the song. There's a better home awaiting. Normally that would be G, but a lot of people put that E minor in. So keep your ear open for that very common substitution of the E minor for a G. It's a 6 in the key of G. Here's another example, the song I'll Fly Away. When I die, hallelujah, by and by, I'll fly away. So if you're playing in the key of G and you hear a minor chord and you try this E minor and that doesn't sound right, well, your next possibility is an A minor, the chord built on the 2. That's fairly common. Ooh, ride me high. Tomorrow's the day my bride's gonna come. It's another tequila sunrise, staring slowly across the sky. You said goodbye. So there's one last minor chord that's fairly common in the key of G, that being B minor. Puff the magic dragon, live by the sea. Same chord changes are heard in this song. Pulled out of Nazareth, I was feeling bad, half past dead. Without going too far down the music theory rabbit hole, those 3 chords, the 6, the 2, and the 3, are naturally occurring minor chords in any given key, should you harmonize the notes of the scale. When you hear songs performed in a minor key, they often have a lot of chords to them. Some of them will break down as simply as 1, 4, 5, as they do in a major key. So if we were in the key of A minor, our 1 chord would be A minor. Our 4 chord would be D minor. But when you get to the 5 chord, they'll actually use a major or even the 7th, because that will pull you back to the 1. So instead of having minor, minor, and minor for the 5 remains a 5, 7. Here's an example of a song that uses those 3 chords. Summertime, and the living is easy. The fish are jumping, and the cotton is high. And more on the bluegrass side. I'm just a poor traveling through this world of woe, and there's no sickness, toil or danger to that bright land to which I go. A lot of the concepts we've talked about here in this video are covered in further detail in other videos. I have one on the relative minor and also on the circle of fifths. And the circle of fifths relates to this because once you get onto the circle and start moving around, all of the chords can be seventh chords until they pull you back to the one. So when you're doing a 6, 2, 5, 1, they could all be seventh chords.